Hi, my name is Isabel Mavrides-Calderon. I am 17 years old, and I am a disabled woman and a disability rights activist. Today, June 24th, Roe v. Wade was overturned. My feed has been filled with self-proclaimed disability rights activists celebrating the overturning as a fight against eugenics. This absolutely breaks my heart because I know that reproductive rights and disability rights are inherently tied. In fact, our rights depend on each other. So, using ACLU organizing, I organized a team of disabled people from intersectional identities and disability rights activists and people who have experience in the political field to talk about this issue, to discuss if abortion is eugenics, how disabled people can be further involved in the reproductive rights movement, and how the reproductive rights movement can further include disabled folk. I'm so grateful to have the panel here, and I'm so grateful for the ACLU for allowing me to have this platform. So let's talk about it. Before I introduce you to the incredible panel, let me introduce myself. As I said, my name is Isabel Mavrides-Calderon. I am physically disabled, and I started organizing for disability rights when I was 14 years old. I have a lot of experience organizing with the ACLU, or hosting conferences that I organize myself, having panels come together, focusing on amplifying intersectional voices within the disabled community to focus on civil rights and policy issues. I've also been a protest monitor for the ACLU, mostly focusing on protests relating to disability rights. This has allowed me to see how strongly people feel about this issue on all sides of the argument. Additionally, I also focus on accessibility. I believe that every social justice movement deserves to be accessible and include disabled folk. For example, I worked with the National Climate Change in Australia to make their protest accessible. I strongly believe that disability rights issues need to be amplified in the mainstream media. For this reason, I have worked with MTV to film a series on disability rights. I have worked with Gucci to write articles about the intersection between disability rights and reproductive rights, and other mainstream platforms and news sources to talk about these issues. Now I am so excited for you to meet this panel and learn more about different perspectives on this issue. Hi, everyone. So we're going to begin the panel, and I'm so excited to have our amazing panelists with us. So I'm going to start by introducing everyone. So we're going to start with the incredible Britt, who is a disability justice advocate and a content creator. Her academic background is in medical anthropology, and in addition to raising awareness about disability issues and accessibility, her work examines the intersection of disability rights and mass incarceration. She's a law fellow at the Coelho Center for Disability Law, Innovation, and Policy, and has been featured in publications including Rolling Stones, CNBC, Refinery 29, and Yahoo News. Riv will be starting law school this year to continue advocating for human rights in the legal field. Amazing. So next, Shivangi, who uses they, them pronouns, and if I ever pronounce anyone's name wrong, feel free to correct me, is a queer disabled activist based in Delhi, India. They are currently working as a diversity, equity, and inclusion associate at ThoughtWorks. They also have over 5 years of experience working as an interdependent consultant, researcher, writer, advisor, and facilitator with an emphasis on advocacy for disability, sexuality, gender, policy, arts, education, and accessibility with local and global organizations. That is a lot. That's amazing. Their key areas of work also include disability justice, trans rights, anti-caste, migrant rights, transformative justice, sexuality, gender abolition, anthropology, politics, and technology. Wow. As an artist with a collective called Determined Art Movement, their practices involve journaling, creating signs, poetry, painting on big canvases, walls, or other unique surfaces like their prosthetic shoes and wheelchairs. They like to use the various forms of art for justice, collective organizing, live documentation of political narratives, and radical thoughts. That is incredible. I had trouble saying that because it is so incredible. So next, we're going to introduce the amazing Carmen Rose Fiallo, who is a member of the Patients Rising Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council, where members work to ensure the needs of diverse, marginalized, or underserved patients populations are met equitably. She also works for Nectar Digital Collaborative as a social media and community outreach manager, and they specialize in social media and virtual communications for nonprofits. Carmen Rose is passionate about digital advocacy and accessibility. Amazing. So finally, we have Rebecca, whose pronouns are she, they, and is an 18-year-old disability justice advocate from the United States. She runs an Instagram educational space, which is Neurodivergent Fairy. It's an incredible account. She shares her experiences as a Jewish, queer, disabled, chronically ill woman on topics like neurodivergence and disability, in addition to covering historical movements of importance from the past in her work. Amazing, amazing. So I'm so excited to have you all here. You guys are all incredible panelists. So I'm going to start by asking some questions. So, as we've all seen, especially right now, many people believe abortion is eugenics, and it's often used as a pro-life argument, saying that abortion is happening to protect disabled lives. In fact, many disability rights activists believe this themselves and have spoken out about this themselves. And as disabled people, do you believe abortion is a form of eugenics? And is there nuance to this argument? Anyone can answer this?
I can jump in. I personally am, this is Britt, by the way, I personally am a big fan of nuance in conversations. And I think when it comes to this topic, I think abortion, much like assisted suicide, can be a form of eugenics when we don't bring disability justice into the framework and into the conversation. So I think a lot of times we see that I've seen stories from folks who talk about doctors not being able to fully explain what it's going to mean to have a disabled child, or even in extreme circumstances, advocating for parents to have an abortion if their child is diagnosed with a disability or in the womb, saying that that's the best option. We also see that healthcare and access to care for disabled folks, for chronically ill folks, is not really accessible. It's not affordable, especially in the United States. And so when the cost of having an abortion of a child that might be wanted is more affordable than the cost of having a child with a disability, it's not really a fair choice. And I think if we're going to be pro-choice, we need to make sure that potential parents are able to make a truly informed choice and to have a choice that goes beyond these financial limitations. So I think abortion is an important form of healthcare, but I think when we don't apply a disability justice framework to it, it can become a tool for eugenics and for against disability justice.
That is such a good point, that we can't really look at this as a black and white situation, because at the end of the day, you're totally right. Having a disabled child is just by default an expensive thing to do. And a lot of parents, like people don't go into having a disabled child knowing policies surrounding disability rights. They don't go in knowing these things. And really the only thing that anyone has when they hear disability is what we've been taught by the media, by society, which, as we all know, is often a very ableist narrative. So I think that oftentimes we need to work on also educating parents to learn about disability, to learn about how to have a disabled child. And if, like you said, having resources to help them, because even if a child is wanted, it is by default a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to pay for. And that's not a negative thing to say. Does anyone have any other thoughts on that?
For sure. I feel like it's really frustrating when people use this as a time to care about disabilities when it doesn't feel like they care about disabilities outside of this argument. I feel like if you cared about disabled people, we'd still have a mask mandate, things would be totally different for the pandemic. And, if you really care about kiddos, it's about investing in schools and healthcare and, just all those services, rather than just forcing people to have the children and then not giving them any support once the children is had and once the children is in our society, right? Like, we're not setting that child up for success. We're just making them be born.
Absolutely. The rights don't end after they leave the fetus. Having a child is a commitment for the rest of your life. And the unfortunate thing is, so often we see disabled parents being really unfit and really ableist themselves. So I think that when we knowledgeably go into someone having a disabled child, they need to also learn tools to become anti-ableist themselves, which it's hard to know who is in charge of doing that. Is it educators? Is it doctors? Who is in charge of educating a parent? So it is a really complex issue, and you're totally right. I don't think that we can just stop thinking about it when a child is born. Anyone else?
I can go. So I just wanted to add, coming from India, this conversation is something that is not just confined to people with disabilities. It's still happening to women, like girl child also. So the fetus is often aborted in India because when the parents find out that the gender of the fetus is female. So that is something that like that, if you even with gender, when there is a concern that parents have, then with disability, it's like the conversation has like it's like much more, I feel like, for people in India at least. And so the conversation here about abortion is not just about access to abortion, but it's also about like how there are often so many different marginalized communities that are that are aborted like right at birth. And it tells us a lot of times that when especially when it comes to intersectionality, it tells us that we are irrational for living, like disabled people are irrational for being alive. And it says that to me, it says like people like me shouldn't exist. And what I've always said is that if someone cannot handle disabled or a queer child, then they should definitely not have it. They should definitely not have any children at all, because you never know, like when a person might acquire a disability or something like that. So I think abortion should be allowed in all cases, regardless of the reasoning. But when it is in the law, when the law is being, like, India has a law called it's called the MTP law. Like, I can't remember the full form of it, medical termination of pregnancy law, which was recently changed a little bit, and it's extremely ableist. The wordings are extremely ableist. And I think that it's really important that those kinds of things are not added into the law, because as I said, that it kind of it says that that we shouldn't be existing. And I think if a parent finds out that the fetus is disabled and they don't want to have it, then it's completely their choice. Like my co-panelists have also said. I always say that, like, uh, you know it's kind of a moral statement that you're putting on people when it's added to the law. So it's also like a very medical model of disability, I would say. Like thinking that it's if you abort a child, a fetus with disability, it's like it's that it will solve all your problems. I think it's a very medical model. And yeah, it's quite frustrating that like, killing is the solution to the problem of disability, the quote unquote problem of disability. That's what it seems like often. And it's the same with gender. Even like there has been many laws in India which have tried to make it illegal to abort a female fetus. And I think those kind of laws might be helpful. Like, I mean, I don't know, like, making abortion illegal is also not a good thing to do, obviously. Like, it's if a parent doesn't want a female fetus, then uh, that's saying that's they shouldn't be having a child anyway, I feel like. Yeah, that's all I'll say about that.
You brought so many amazing points and like so much nuance to this conversation that I think, for me, educated like me on like how the abortion rights issue is in different countries, that I think so often we're all kind of stuck in our own little world when it comes to policy and rights. So thank you for bringing that nuance. And you also brought an amazing point that we often think of this as disabilities that children are born with, which so often is not the case. I mean, most disabilities are acquired later in life. So I thank you for bringing that up. No one knows if you're going to end up having a disabled child or not. So thank you. If no one has any other thoughts on this, I'm going to move on to, oh, great.
Yeah, I was going to just add, Shivangi, you brought up a point that was making me think of this intersectionality that you're bringing, and how abortions often can be used sort of to further this like woman agenda, this anti-disability agenda. And I think it's such a good point as folks who are pro-choice. We see, I think, a lot of people who are pro-birth or anti-abortion advocating using that as a narrative of, oh, you should be against abortion because it's primarily affecting girls, it's primarily affecting disabled people. But I think it's a really good point of, it's not abortions that are the issue. It's sexism, it's the patriarchy, it's ableism, racism. And so the answer isn't to outlaw abortion, but rather, how do we solve these systemic issues? How do we solve these systemic biases that we see in our societies, so that that's not becoming a factor in reproductive rights and reproductive choice? Like, how do we solve those issues rather than just banning abortion?
That's so true. And I think, like you said, this is also a very common factor in the MAID argument and the euthanasia argument, that, like, yes, it's a right that people like should have, but what are the other factors that go in, and how do we address those? How do we give people the structure to be able to make that choice, not just based off of desperation, but based on like truly what they want? So thank you so much for bringing that into this conversation. So for all of you here, a lot of us have very different intersectional identities that go beyond just disability. I know no disabled person's experience is the same because our community is not a monolith. So do you feel that the vast majority of the current pro-choice movement includes disabled folk and the rights in how the movement is coming across? I know that's a very tricky question because it's hard to categorize an entire movement. We see so many different factors of it, so many different identities bringing it forward. But when I'm asking this question, I guess I'm more so thinking about the mainstream movement, the movement that we see in the biggest protests.
Yeah, I'll answer that. So I feel like the movement mainly just solely focuses on having the right to get an abortion and doesn't go beyond like forced sterilization and how people in conservatorships, I cannot say that word, I apologize, are forced to take birth control or have birth control, things like they're not allowed to get them out, like we saw with Britney Spears. They're forced into situations where they don't have any choice, and the movement kind of leaves that out completely. And that's probably because disproportionately the people affected by those types of things are disabled women, especially like Black women. And I feel like if the movement will only looks at having the right to abortion and not the right to have control over your body entirely, and just like even having control over if you get a hysterectomy or not, then it just is inherently leaving out disabled people.
For sure. I also feel like at a very basic level, I've noticed, I feel like disabled people are left out because the materials and the revolution itself isn't accessible. And it's like at a very basic level, it's like alt text, image descriptions, caption your videos, like offer remote options, you know, interpreters, like, you know, not everyone can physically show up and march. I know I can. I mean, I had that conversation with my partner yesterday. Yesterday was Pride in Pittsburgh, and I was like, yeah, I can't do the march. You know, we can go walk around, but I can't do the march. So that's not, I think that's what people view as like the revolution, is like showing up physically in person and marching. And that's just not accessible to everybody. But that doesn't mean that, okay, well, just the people that can make it will fight. Like everyone should be able to. And it's like, if we make all of this material and all of these things more accessible, more people can join the fight and more people can be included. So you got to meet everybody where they're at, because everybody is touched by this issue. Like this issue touches every community in some way. And so you've got to make sure that at a very basic level, everyone can just access it. That's just like the bare minimum. And I don't even feel like I see that.
That's such a good point. I know I've seen a lot of conversation about when the movement started to arise, when the leak came out about the Supreme Court decision. There was like a lot of people calling for a strike of all workers that lasted many weeks. And I know so many people brought up that, well, that's really only possible for people who have the financial backings to be able to survive without their job. And so many of these factors of the movement aren't accessible, not just to disability, but to so many different identities. And that's so right. It is so valid to interact with the movement in ways that go just beyond physical protesting, physical marching. Because I know for a fact that, like, so far any protest I've been to related to the movement hasn't been accessible in any way, shape, or form. And I mean, so many of the protests that are happening lately have just been kind of spur of the moment, which I see how that could be very powerful. But at the same time, it really does leave out disabled folk who want to help. So thank you for bringing that up.
Carmen Rose, I definitely agree. Like the revolution must be accessible or it's not the revolution. And so I think that we get left out of the conversation around reproductive rights so often. I think we're used as a talking point for both sides, for anti-abortion folks to say, no, like disabled people are going to be disproportionately affected. People are going to abort disabled fetuses. And then for pro-choice folks to say, we need abortion because what if somebody doesn't want to have a disabled child and they find out that the fetus is disabled? They should be able to have an abortion. So it's like we're kind of used as a talking point for both, but our voices aren't being amplified by either side. What we need, like Rebecca brought up, the access of conservatorship, Britney Spears IUD, the access to sterilization if we want it, and freedom from forced sterilization if we want to have children. It's not, disabled folks are really just, our stories aren't being amplified. We're not even invited to these kinds of protests to speak. They're not accessible to us. So you're never hearing from disabled folks about their experiences, which are equally as powerful as the experiences that non-disabled folks have to offer and to share. And so I really hope that the organizers, the movement will become more accessible and realize that there are some very powerful stories that can be told to advocate for reproductive rights if only we are included and the movement is made accessible to us.
Yeah, I also completely agree with that. With what Britt, Rebecca, and Carmen, all of you, whatever you have said, like the movements are not accessible at all. And in the global south, it's even the most basic things are not there. Like the hospitals don't have ramps, or they don't have not even like the basic form of ramp, or like a handbook which is in braille, or people who speak sign language. So when I was working with the Youth Coalition, so I used to consult with the Youth Coalition for Sexual and Reproductive Rights, and I had focus groups with disabled people from a lot of different global south countries. And this is what we found out, is that most of the materials that in schools and in colleges and they're not even accessible. The SRHR information is not accessible. They don't have, people with disabilities, we don't even have the basic knowledge of how the rights that we have as citizens of whichever country we are part of. I think that is where a lot of, like, especially people who come from sensory disabilities, they we are constantly kind of in the global south. What I've seen is we're constantly adjusting to become a part of something, like to enter a building. We're adjusting, we're trying to force ourselves in, but like Britt said, we are never invited, we are never welcomed in spaces like this, where our voice needs to be heard. And there are so many advocates, people with disabilities who are advocates who are constantly talking about pro-choice movement, like what their role is in the pro-choice movement, and how we can have less ableist laws related to abortion. So I think that basic thing needs to happen, where at least the knowledge is given to people with disabilities and youth with disabilities especially. Yeah.
That's such a good point. I think we often forget that every aspect of getting an abortion itself needs to be accessible. Every aspect of healthcare itself needs to be accessible, which is so often left out. Just the point of hospitals being accessible to get into, having providers that know how to handle disabilities. So really, that has to be a much wider conversation of how we make healthcare procedures itself be accessible. And like Britt, you mentioned that so often we're used as a talking point, and I think that is so incredibly true. I think, like, on all sides of the movement, we are often used as a statistic. Our lives itself, our deaths themselves, are used as a statistic to push a point, but then our actual voices are just pushed out of the conversation completely. So I think you can't just tokenize a population for a movement without actually inviting the population to speak on their opinions on the movement. So thank you for bringing that up. Anyone else have any thoughts on this question? Great. So now that we've had this conversation, we've kind of answered this. How can we implicitly include disabled folk into conversations surrounding disability rights now that we've brought up how we really aren't included? Anyone have any ideas?
I think it starts with asking accommodations. And I feel like when we talk about accommodations, we think of ramps, which still we don't have everywhere, but that's like the bare minimum. Like we're so far past that. Like as somebody with chronic migraine, I'm like, if I really had all the accommodations I need, we're talking like fix the lights, like no sense, like all that stuff. Like it's so beyond just a ramp, which we don't even have that. So you got to ask people what accommodations are. You got to include interpreters. And like I said, you had to have virtual options. And I feel like, especially if anything over the last 2 years has taught us, like everything can be virtual. Like we said we couldn't do it, but we found out we can do it. And it's still possible to create hybrid options. Like we're not saying like everyone's got to stay home, but like have an option where you can be in person and you can be at home and your impact feels the same, right? It's got to be equitable. It can't just be like, oh, here's an option for disabled people, but it's, it's not the same impact. Like it's got to be an equitable position in the revolution.
Like even on an online type of way, anything that in general is educational or really anything on Instagram in general needs to have like alt text and image descriptions and captions and all this stuff, because I see so many posts, usually from like non-disabled infographic people, and they don't include any of those things, but they're talking about issues that are important to disabled or disability justice, or just like anything in general. Everything that you post should have accessibility to it, no matter if it's like something that could potentially be intersectional with disability or not. And if we're starting like a lot of youth movement stuff starts online, if we're not including disabled people from the beginning in those movements, then going forward, those movements as they get bigger aren't going to be accessible.
That's such a true point. I know for me, it's always been really frustrating to see, because this is such a big issue that has so many emotions surrounding, especially when the leak first came out. So many people were just getting so much content out quickly. And when I would comment on the fact that it wasn't accessible, they would be like, I just needed to get it done quick. This is too important to take the time to caption. This is too important to write an image description. And it's also, I saw that going on with a lot of these protests that were going on very quickly. Everyone was like, we don't have time to have an accessibility consultant. We don't have time to get the proper structures to get an ambulance in time on call. That really isn't an excuse. Not having the time to get something done shows that it's not really being done well. And I think that happens so often with organizing, especially a lot of organizing. The narrative surrounding it is, in order to be truly revolutionary, we need to do it spur of the moment. We need to do it quickly. We need to not really follow the rules, but by doing that, you're leaving out a whole population. So thank you for bringing that up. Anyone else?
I was going to say to that point too, it's like when folks say we had to do this quickly or we had to do this immediately, so therefore we couldn't make it accessible, it shows that there's no disabled folks in that organization or in that conversation to begin with. If you are committed to being accessible, you should already have somebody whose job is to focus on the accessibility and the accommodations for your protest. If you're making graphics and things like that, especially if you're a large organization, why do you not already have somebody who, while you're doing the graphics, can do the image description or the alt text for you? And I think that's probably one of the biggest pieces that I think is important, is there should just be disabled folks involved at every stage of the conversation. If you're a large organization doing reproductive justice, you should have disabled folks on your staff, or you should have disability consultants. If you're holding a panel, you should have at least one disabled person, ideally more, that you're inviting to talk about their experiences. And if you're somebody who is doing social justice work, you should know these best practices. And so I think that's, if folks want to make movement accessible, that's definitely where it begins, is just talking to disabled people, making us a part of your movement, and recognizing that the way to do things quickly and also do them accessibly is just to understand these things and have disabled folks you can reach out to who are happy to focus on that part of the movement.
Yes, that's so true. Sorry, continue. I was just saying yes. I don't have anything to say.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that also, like, what is really needed is like going like much deeper and like trying to like challenge those systemic ableist and systemically sexist, queerphobic laws and practices that are that continue to remain in healthcare services, in capital, like political buildings, in all of these places where there are no disabled people. There is we don't even have like a lot of people with disabilities don't even have access to getting that training or education to become a doctor, to become a politician, to become a person who can uh, make space in make their own space in a um, in a a place where they can make decisions, I guess, like where they're able to influence the laws that are there and make those challenge those systemic issues that exist. So I think that is also very important, uh, where there is training for people with disabilities to go into healthcare fields, to go into uh, uh, um, politics and things like that, because uh, that's where all the decision is being made, and those are the places we are not often welcomed. If education is not accessible, then like then nothing is accessible. If the systems are not changed, if the laws in the constitution, the wordings in the constitution is not changed, like even like right now in India, the constitution of India, which is really great, but it still has words like very ableist words related to mental illness and things like that. So those things like really need to, like we really need to go deeper and look at how these beliefs and things can be changed culturally. Yeah.
That is such a good point. I'm gonna just use Brit here because I think this idea of proximity to power is really important and how we actually acquire that. And I've just learned so much from your Instagram itself, Brit, where you talk about the process of trying to get into law school. I mean, you have been successful, but I know you've brought up what a struggle it is to get accommodations and all these barriers you've faced. So even these positions as like being a lawyer, which is definitely a incredibly important role in making change, are so hard to get to. Academia itself isn't accessible. Every factor of getting that power we need to be those politicians making a change, to be the policymakers, isn't accessible itself. Way beyond just activism that is happening on a grassroots level, those really powerful positions that, for being honest, do have a lot of final say in who gets rights, aren't accessible themselves. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know. Sorry, I'm piggybacking on myself. I know for me, whenever I've had a position that I have like a wider, more mainstream audience, honestly, even just here with the ACLU, it has honestly been because I am in a position where I don't have to ask for accommodations. And that has put me in a privileged space as a disabled person, that I have a very, very low support needs, that I'm often given these positions, but I very much know that that is just a privilege that I have that so many other disabled folk are being left out of. So I think seeing how this power intersects with who gets a voice in this movement is really important.
Totally. And I think it's like disabled folks belong in all places where decisions are being made. But it's so important for those of us who might have an easier time getting to those positions to bring in the rest of our community with us. And I think that is one of the most important things you can do as a disability advocate, is to recognize that your experience with disability is not universal, and that you have to kind of be willing to go to bat for the rest of your community, to say, hey, like, we're doing this action, or we're working on this thing, and it needs to be more accessible, but I don't have enough experience to talk to what needs to be done. You should, bring in this person who has this experience with disability, or hey, we need to be bringing in more people who need more accommodations, who have more access needs, whose voices are being heard less and less. I think that is a responsibility that we have, because it's like, the rest of the world, the abled world, isn't going to go to bat for any of us. We have to be the ones that stick for each other, that look out for each other. Because if we don't speak up about disability issues, if we don't look out for those of us in our community who have more access needs, like, who's going to?
That's such a good point. I think so often that also just brings a bigger point of who organizations are hiring. Because the disabled community isn't a monolith itself, all of us really have our own experiences with accommodations that are needed for protests. So I know for me, when I'm going into like doing accessibility consulting for a protest, my first thought is always, how can I make this physically accessible because I have a physical disability? But it's really taken kind of educating myself and speaking to more activists on how we can make this accessible to all different forms of disability. So I think that as disabled people, especially working in fields related to accessibility, it is our job to just go beyond just our own experiences. And for organizations, it's their job to either hire more disabled people from different types of disabilities, or make sure that the disabled person they are hiring is educated on a vast amount of disabilities. I mean, even just looking back at like my younger self, I sometimes cringe at the work I did for certain protests, thinking this was not truly accessible, but I thought I was being accessible, but I wasn't. So I think that it takes a lot of learning and unlearning for all of us. Just being disabled doesn't mean in and of itself that we know everything about disability rights. So a lot of educating to be done.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's really important because I think when disabled folks are finally brought to the table, people think that we're speaking for all disabled folks, and there is so much diversity within the disabled community. Like my needs as somebody with a brain injury are so different than somebody with another disability, and I don't know everyone's accommodation needs. I barely know mine. I'm like still learning my accommodation needs, as I go through life. And so I feel like it's really important to ask people, what accommodations you need, and not just being like, okay, whatever that one disabled person needs, and then we're good for everyone. Because I feel like I'm learning so much from the disabled community, like every single day. It goes back to that education piece that like we weren't taught. I wasn't barely taught any of this in school. Like I learned about the ugly laws from Isabel's Instagram, like all this stuff I tell people. I'm like, no, I didn't learn this in school. I learned this like a week ago on Instagram, and now I'm telling you about it. Like I'm not an expert just because I'm in the disabled community. And there's so much that I learn on social media. And that's why I feel like it's so important to make sure everything's accessible. Because it's like, if you add those alt text image descriptions and captions, like so many more people can access this stuff that's already really hard for us to access and gain. And I think the more people have that history of the disabled experience, like the forced sterilization and the ugly laws, like you start to understand where the ableism comes from. Like when I learned about the ugly laws from Isabel, I was like, well, no wonder like people look at disabled people the way they do. Not saying that's right, but like you can see where it came from and you can see the progression. You're like, yeah, it makes a ton of sense that we're at where we're at with the pandemic and how we're being treated, because look at where we started. Like, what do you expect? So it's really important to know that history because the context is so important. It's not like disability issues just started with the overturning of Roe v. Wade. There's all this history, but we're really not taught it in school or anything. I mean, I have to seek it out, and I pretty much learn everything from Isabel's Instagram, all of your Instagrams.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of, well, first off, thank you for the plug, but the idea of like having to educate ourselves is so important. And I think so often in an attempt to educate other people, we often forget that we need to be fully educated in order to do that. I think that just having an infographic account myself, I've learned how easy it is to make false infographics. I'm just looking back, I made my account when I was 13 years old, and I'm looking back at like what I knew there. I knew so little about disability rights. And so I have had to learn that like it takes true introspection, is that a word? True like research to many different sources in order to make informed content. So honestly, getting the content out the fastest isn't always the most responsible thing to do. This isn't the most accessible thing to do. So I think that, yeah, knowing the power that comes with educating others is really important too. So
Yeah, and
continue.
sorry. We brought up the fact that like educational spaces didn't really introduce us to disabled information or history at all. And I'm like currently in high school, right? So when we talk about current world issues or when we read articles in general, I've noticed that they're almost always leaving out disabled people and like other marginalized people in general, and that I have to be the one to bring it up. And I love my teachers, but I feel like even teachers who are going to be talking about world issues, they should try to look up like all of the kind of different groups of people or the way that different people are harmed by certain current events that are happening in order to normalize knowing the intersectional kind of harm that could be caused when talking about issues. And when we were talking about how it's hard to even get into like positions of power or institutions like colleges and stuff like that, it's not even, I think, like not getting accommodated that kind of keeps us out. It's the trauma in the past that we've been taught that like we're not worthy of accommodations, or that like accommodating us is unfair to other people. Like I know personally the amount of ableism I've gone through in school. If I had never started my account and like learned from people like you, I would have totally internalized as being 100% my fault. And just like, I think that trauma plays a major part in keeping out disabled people. And I would dare say far more than necessarily not accommodating would, because it really messes with your ability to accept yourself as a disabled person.
Yeah, and I think this is where representation also comes into play. I know for me, the first disabled person I really saw with like my condition online was Brit. And I know my sister went to Chicago and she saw one of Brit's posts and she's like, "Oh my goodness, look at this girl." And I didn't know that it was even possible to achieve these things, but I was a post of like Brit graduating from Chicago talking about it. And I remember that moment because it kind of made me realize that these are things that I can achieve. And I think just seeing like you yourself like achieving those things and going on to do this proved to me that like I deserve those accommodations. I deserve to fight to get to a point where I could also be successful. So I think that representation just and thinking that we deserve these accommodations and how we go about them is so important.
Yeah, 100%. I feel like the one thing that I didn't expect when I became disabled was like my own internalized ableism. And the same thing with when I came out as queer, like my own internalized homophobia. Like just because I'm disabled and just because I'm queer doesn't mean I didn't grow up in an ableist and a homophobic and a racist society and it didn't affect me. So it is that piece of like doubting myself and like, oh, I don't need those accommodations, or oh, I don't need this or that. And like you doubt yourself, and there's that own internalized ableism, and like I'm in my own way. And so it's like unlearning that and, recognizing that and saying like, being like, I do need these access needs and I'm not a burden because of that. And I'm not, doing too much or asking for too much. And so it's like, it starts within ourselves. Like I definitely have internalized ableism that I have to work on. Just because I'm disabled doesn't mean it's like poof, like it's all perfect and it's fixed, like all the time.
That's such a good.
Yeah, and I also wanted to add uh, like that trauma is like what Rebecca was saying about the trauma is always like so real, and it sticks to our bodies so much. Um, and I think what really helps is like community work, and like really recognizing within our communities what are the who are the people who will support us. And I think a lot of people are doing that in disability justice, where we are constantly trying to question what even success or what all of these things even mean, achievements mean, because this whole conversation about reproductive justice is about oftentimes is about when it comes to disability justice and abortion. A lot of times it's about like which bodies are the most desirable, which bodies are the most capable of like achieving good things in lives, or things like that. And that is something so capitalist that we really need to like dismantle that. We really need to dismantle the idea that like if someone, for example, a person with disability who's not successful, or who's not constantly voicing their opinions, or someone who's not like or someone who's just surviving in their own life, and who's trying to just live their life dealing with all the trauma that is around them, is as resilient as someone who's like getting a PhD, or getting going like getting a job or things like that, because that is a very rare disabled population, at least in the global south. Like there's hardly any people with disabilities who are like in really amazing positions, who have a proper education and things like that. So I think that is what another thing that disability justice has taught me. Yeah.
That's such a good point that I think I need to like many times like it's part of my internalized ableism I need to break down on what is this idea of conventional success. I mean, especially like you said, growing up in a capitalistic world, so many of us think as success as who can contribute monetarily to society, who is productive in this very rudimentary way. So I think just going beyond just that to see like if that is our baseline of who deserves to be born, then that is also going to add a lot of ableism to this conversation of abortion. So thank you. That's such a good point. So we have once again spoken on this as we covered this, but many of us here have vast intersectional identities. How does the pro-choice movement leave those other identities behind beyond just disability, and what can we do to include them? I know this has already been a little touched on, but again, if anyone has any thoughts.
I think for me, the first thing that comes to mind is just that we need to make space for complexity, for nuance, and for there to be lots of gray areas. I think a lot of times we want these issues and the solutions to them to be very straightforward and easy, and to be quick, to be clear, and they're not always going to be. And I think we've be comfortable with that being okay, and to be comfortable with it not always being the easiest route to take. I think when it comes to reproductive rights, for example, one example that comes to mind is, folks wanting to be able to say women when talking about it, because they say that people who give birth feels like it's longer to say or more of a mouthful to say, when that is actually a more accurate framing of the folks who are involved in the movement. And I think that we have to be okay with there being multiple layers. I think we have to be okay with the conversation of reproductive rights being, we should all have access to abortion and birth control. And those of us who want to be able to give birth, who are dealing with forced sterilization or conservatorships, like we saw with Britney Spears, that is also reproductive justice. And we also need to be advocating for that, for folks who are being told they shouldn't be parents or give birth to be able to do so. And so I think it's being comfortable with that complexity and also recognizing how to bring in more intersectional voices, being okay with the fact that we need to talk about race, disability, socioeconomic status, gender identity, sexuality, in order to talk properly about reproductive justice.
Totally. I feel like I love that we've been bringing up intersectionality in this conversation because it's so important. Like I was having this conversation the other day that like you can't separate out all your identities, like as a queer woman, like I saw a stat the other day that was like bisexual women access abortions 3 times more than heterosexual women. And so it's like these issues affect different groups different ways. And, I saw the stat again that Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die in childbirth than white women are. So it's like we have to put these people at the forefront of these conversations if we want the solution to impact everybody. And disabled people are trigger warning sexually assaulted at higher rates than non-disabled people, so they need to be able to access care. And if we're talking about shutting down these clinics too, a lot of queer folks feel really seen at these clinics and get care beyond abortion care at these clinics, and they get better care for their gender and their pronouns and their sexualities and their identities at these clinics than they do in the mainstream healthcare system, than they do with their doctors. So it's so much more than just abortion rights, and it's a class issue too, because we all know that banning abortions it's just banning safe abortions. Wealthy people are still going to access abortion. They're going to be able to cross state lines and get to a state where they can have it. But folks that don't have those funds aren't going to be able to get safe abortions. And if they really need an abortion, they're going to figure out a way to do it. It's just not going to be a safe way, and like I read something the other day that Medicare doesn't cover the cost of abortions. And you got a lot of disabled folks on state and federal health insurance that will not be able to access these things if we get rid of it. And again, we're just banning safe abortions. Like we know who's still going to be able to access these abortions, and we know people are still going to be able to do it. It's just not marginalized folks, and it's not people with these marginalized identities. So you have to think about, okay, how does this affect queer people? How does this affect, people of color? How does this affect non-binary people, trans people? Because each community needs to be heard and brought to the forefront. This isn't just a straight white woman issue, which I feel like that's what we think of when we think of abortion. We just think of straight white women, and it's so beyond that.
Mm-hmm. this idea of complexity and intersectionality is so important, and I think is so often left out. I think just even having this conversation has opened myself up to these different ways in which this intersectionality can be seen and these different forms of complexity. So going on to the next question. I know as a disability rights activist myself who has been very vocally pro-choice online, I often get comments that my pro-choice views go against my views as a disability rights activist, being told that I'm being hypocritical or like going against my movement by both disabled and non-disabled people. So are reproductive rights inherently tied to disability rights? Can we see them separately? Are they two issues that we should focus on in a vacuum, or do they come together? Kind of coupling up on that, is someone still advocating for disability rights if they are pro-life? I don't really know my own thoughts on this, so feel free to take your time.
So I guess like the way that I look at it with kind of the first part of your question is that I personally don't think that you can be like pro-life, but also be in kind of the disability justice and disability rights framework, because I think when you say pro-life, that means much more than just not wanting people who can give birth to have access to abortion. It also involves like taking away the ability for people to choose what to do with their own bodies, which goes into so many more things, like even like medical treatment, like what can doctors do to you without your consent, like conservatorships, and like also like the forced sterilization of disabled women and disabled people with uteruses in general, especially like disabled minors, especially. So I think to say that you're practicing disability justice or propping up disability rights while also being pro-life, it can't really work. Like that's kind of impossible in my opinion. Those two things are mutually exclusive.
Yeah, I feel like I was just actually reading another plug for Isabel. I was just reading your article about being pro-choice and a disability rights activist, and I thought it was really interesting because it's like if you are a disability rights activist, there's also the piece of like it's not always safe for disabled people to have a pregnancy. You know, Isabel, you were talking yourself about like having spinal injuries and what it would be like to get pregnant, and you know that could really hurt and if not kill the mother of that child. And so it's like if you are a disability rights activist, there's that piece to it too. So it's like saying that, oh, I'm a disability, like I care about disabled rights, that's why I'm pro-life. Like you're missing the piece there. And I feel like that's again just using us as a token and a statistic, because it's like, do you really care about us? Because like let's think through the argument, let's break it down. Like you're not really there for disabled people. And I think the biggest thing is like, how do you show up for disabled people outside of using them for that? Like how do you fight for our rights? How do you fight for our accessibility beyond just using us as like a point that when you really think about it doesn't actually make sense?
I definitely agree. And I think Shivangi touched on this earlier, talking about how disability justice teaches us so much about what sort of bodies are desirable and valued in our society. And I think that that's so much of the conversation around reproductive justice, like how are our bodies perceived, who gets to make decisions about our bodies and what our bodies are used for and what is a good body. And I think a lot of the quote unquote pro-life argument is surrounding, you know, what folks think the bodies of people who can give birth should be used for, what their purpose is, what their value is. And I think that it's not at all hypocritical for disability advocates to be pro-choice, because so much of disability justice is us being able to determine the futures of our body minds, the values of our body minds, and getting access to healthcare. And I firmly believe abortion is a form of healthcare. If folks want to say that they are pro-life, they have to be fighting for our lives after birth. They have to be making it accessible and affordable to exist as a disabled person. And unfortunately, I see a lot of folks on the anti-abortion side not quite aligning with those values. I think that it's very important for disabled folks to be able to make decisions about whether they are going to give birth or not, to have that power, to have that choice. And I also, you know, I don't want to see a world where we have all of these disabled children born to parents who don't want them. I don't think that that's a good future for us either. I want that choice to be there, and I want those choices to be informed choices, but I definitely think that disability justice and reproductive rights are inherently linked. That importance of choice and power over our own bodies is so central to both.
Yeah, bodily
Yeah,
autonomy is like a main pillar of disability
yeah,
rights.
yeah. Absolutely. I was just gonna bring that up. Bodily autonomy is such a, I think if we are disability advocates, I think we are automatically pro-choice advocates as well, because a lot of the work that disability advocates do, like as in disability justice, is so much about pro-choice. And what you said, like the bodily autonomy, is such a big part of everything that we are trying to say, that we are able to make the decision as people with disability, what happens to us, what rights we have, what things we can access, and the decisions, every decision that we make, it's our choice. And so I think we're automatically pro-choice. Like it's there's no like one side or the other. Yeah.
Thank you. So I keep talking about how Britt is a badass, but I have a follow-up question about that. So Britt, you're going to law school. First of all, congrats. As a disabled person and as a disabled person with a uterus, how does that inspire your career path, and how do you believe it will define what you do with your career?
Yeah, great question. And thank you. Yes, very excited. I don't know if most folks know this, but only less than 1% of lawyers identify as disabled. And so I think my decision to go into the legal field was heavily, heavily influenced by my experience as a disabled person, by seeing not only how much discrimination, inequity we face in the world, but also how inaccessible the legal system is to us. So many times I would watch myself or other disabled folks go through experiences of inaccessibility and oppression. And people would say, well, you should sue about that. And the response would always be, I don't have the time for that. I don't have the money for that. I'm just trying to keep myself alive and afloat. I don't have time to try to navigate this, especially not with an able-bodied lawyer who isn't going to understand my experiences. So I want to be one of those people who are bringing disability justice to places of power, and fighting to make that legal system more accessible for folks. And I think that when I think about it defining me, I think it will define and shape me as much as my disabled identity has defined and shaped me in all aspects of my life, and that it inherently shapes my interactions with the world. It shapes how people view me, and it shapes how I approach issues. And I think something that has been really powerful for me, both in doing legal work that I currently do as a paralegal and in applying to law schools, is recognizing that the things that make me different are the things that make me powerful. That my identity as a disabled person is more than just saying that it's not a weakness. It is in fact a strength. In my work doing prisoners' rights law and advocacy, my identity as a disabled person has allowed me to connect with our clients in ways that other attorneys and other legal workers have not been able to. It's allowed me to approach issues with our clients who have been in solitary confinement from a standpoint of accessibility. We had clients that had a very difficult time talking to people, engaging with the legal system because of their needs. And it just seemed like the most natural thing in the world for me to say, hey, you know what? Let's talk about what you need. You need someone to be sitting farther away from you when we're having a conversation. We can do that. You want to be in a small, quiet, dark room? We can make that happen. How can we work around your needs, your PTSD, your anxiety, your trauma? How can we create accommodations for that? And it also even helped me when looking at things like medical records and documents. It's helped me spot things that attorneys even have missed. It's helped me to approach interviews with clients when we're prepping for trial in cases of police brutality, to ask them questions about their ongoing injuries or disabilities in ways that other attorneys wouldn't think to. So it's given me so much of a strength that I see as an advantage in that field, being able to bring all of my identity as a disabled disabled person and all of my experience with disability justice into that realm, I think will make me a better lawyer. So I plan to continue fighting for disability rights as a lawyer, and I really want to be one of those movement lawyers who, is using the little shred of power I will have to get into some good trouble and to fight for a more accessible world for all of us.
Amazing. I'm really happy that you are going in that path. So the next, I think Jen just joined us. So hi, Jen. We have started the questions. So if you do get settled at some point, I do have a question directly aimed for you, but I'll give you a sec. So I will ask the next question aimed for the group. I know many of us in this panel openly identify as part of the LGBTQ plus community. For anyone who feels comfortable answering, how does that identity inform your activism on reproductive rights? And do you feel that your rights as an LGBTQ plus person is included in the movement for anyone?
Yeah, I think at a very bare minimum, this starts with what we talked about with the language of saying like abortion and care is a human rights issue. It's not a women's issue, it's a human rights issue, right? Because it's not just cis women that get abortions. So that's like the bare minimum. And then seeing like how each sexuality and identity accesses this care and what are their barriers, because statistically LGBTQ folks have a harder time accessing healthcare and face more discrimination. I know a lot of friends that, go to clinics more. Like I personally had to go to Planned Parenthood recently, and I felt much more validated and seen at a clinic than I did in like the generic healthcare spaces. So this is really an LGBTQ issue too, because we access this stuff at higher rates and, face higher discrimination and more barriers and more obstacles. So it is, again, that intersectionality piece of like, how does that part of your identity impact how you access healthcare? And it's so much more beyond just abortions. And I think also a part of being the LGBTQ community, like the thing that really scared me was when this all came out, I was realizing that like Roe v. Wade is really based on the right to privacy. And if we pull back on Roe v. Wade and we pull back on that right to privacy, like we're just opening the door for so much. Like we're opening the door to overturn gay marriage. We're opening the door to overturn, contraceptives and even interracial marriage. Like the night that it came out, my partner and I had to have the conversation of like, let's do power of attorney, because I don't know if we're engaged and we're not legally married yet. And at first I was like, oh, we got to get legally married soon. And I'm like, well, no, if they overturn it, doesn't matter. So we got to do power of attorney to protect ourselves. And this is the second time we've had to have this conversation since we've been together in the past 2 years. And it's 2022. So it's like, and then you get gaslit because a lot of people are like, oh, they'd never overturn gay marriage and they'd never go that far. But it's like, but we're talking about overturning abortion. So if we're already there, other stuff is in the works. And once one gets overturned, it's really scary. So I think also you have to come at this with the thought of like, how is this affecting LGBTQ folks and how are they feeling? Because it's so much more than just Roe v. Wade. So you got to see like all the context and everything that everyone's worried about. And like, don't gaslight people for feeling like, okay, if this happens, this is going to affect my other marginalized identities in a lot of ways. Because it's not outrageous for us to go to step B and C and D, because that's just how marginalized folks think. Like you take back one of our rights, what else is going to go? And so I think that's been the scariest part for me as a queer woman, is realizing like I could lose a lot of my rights if we open the door to overturning the right to privacy.
And if I can jump in on that one, what a lot of people don't realize is that the fights for abortion access and even just reproductive care do affect our LGBTQ communities. Gender affirming care is not just a trans focused issue. It affects everybody. What a lot of people don't realize is the act of hormones is not just a trans inclusive issue. It includes everybody. I'm a person who I consider myself the token straight, but I actually get gender affirming care because I have PCOS. I take hormones. That is something that affects everybody. And when we realize the intersectionality of these issues, helping our marginalized communities really makes the difference in how we help others. And so we need to really look at this not as an othering of folks, because it's super easy for everyone to say, oh, that is not my battle. That is not my fight. No, this is a battle that affects everyone. If we don't protect our most vulnerable communities right now, then we are at risk for affecting society as a whole.
Yeah, for me as well, I think being a queer person with disability, I am constantly reimagining what love, family, sex, desire, all of these things mean, especially in a capitalist society where productivity is everything, and really, questioning those structures because the government, they want us to be cisgender, heterosexual. They want us to get married and produce babies because it's profitable. These are very profitable things that for the economy or for the idea of culture or society is, and that's the reason why it's still there in these laws where like Carmen was saying that marriage is not supported, or even like friendships are not supported. If, for example, if I wanted to travel with like a friend of mine, and I wanted to get an insurance policy, to include like a travel insurance policy that includes them, we have to get it separately. You can't get it unless you're a mother, father, you're related by blood or something like that. So there are so many things like that which are out there. Even in India, we cannot even like open a joint bank account if you're the same sex partner, or if you're living with your chosen families. So I think those things are like very important. And as Jen was also saying, it's about collective access. It's not just an individual accessibility aspect. For example, if you have a building which has ramps, but it does not have a gender neutral bathroom, then it's not accessible. If there is if like in India, there's a lot of buildings which are like really high, high end, and they have ramps and they have all the accessibility needs, but those buildings don't allow people from lower economic statuses, people from lower caste statuses to come into the building, which is really, really problematic. And that is where intersectionality is important, where all of these identities are welcomed, because there are so many people with disabilities, like over here in this conversation as well, that come with so many intersectionalities. Yeah.
That is such a good point, especially about thinking about how accessibility is so often tied to income. So many accessible products in and of themselves are incredibly expensive. So many schools that are accessible, a lot of schools for disabled folk are private schools that have incredibly high tuitions. So many of these factors play a huge point. And also, piggybacking about what both Jen and Shivangi said, thinking about how we can make this movement intersectional goes way beyond just the minoritized communities. It benefits absolutely everyone, beyond just people who want to be in same-sex marriages, also people who, like you said, are living in chosen families, not just people who need gender-affirming care, but people who have conditions like PCOS. All of these factors benefit absolutely everyone in our population, beyond just those who identify as part of a particular community. Anyone have any more thoughts on this? Great. So my final question, Jen, since you just joined us here, I will give you a vast introduction in the beginning of this video. I will put in. But Jen, you have a lot of experience working on political campaigns. Do you think reproductive rights are going to be gained through electoral politics?
So this is a tricky question because it's a yes and no. So when we talk about reproductive access and reproductive rights, there is a lot of pressure that we put on our elected officials and even political candidates to really talk about choice and access. But the way that we talk about reproductive choice and access is still very patriarchal. It's very gendered and very biased in the way that we talk about this issue. So one of my biggest pet peeves is when a political candidate says that reproductive choice is a woman's issue. It is not a woman's issue. It is an issue for everybody. When we talk about the ways that reproductive choice affect our communities and our society, there's no way that this is just exclusively the burden of a woman. We talk about our folks who are non-binary and our folks who are LGBTQ, or even income inequality and status. This goes into every type of race, socioeconomic background. And for candidates to not understand that are, you know, they're doing themselves a disservice to not only them as candidates, but also doing a disservice to the communities that they aim to represent. So while I think that it's important that we continue the issue of reproductive choice and talking about accessibility and making sure that we fight for the rights of others, it could be solved electorally, but then we also do ourselves a disservice by looking at partisan lines and political lines and saying, oh yeah, we're just going to go ahead and vote for the person who identifies in a political party that, regardless of what they personally stand for, you know, claims to be in support of reproductive choice. That's not always the case. You know, what we're starting to see is that there are candidates who cross through partisan lines who really don't stand and advocate for the accessibility and choices of others. So we can't necessarily rely on it electorally. It's really up to us as a society and a community to really hold our candidates and our elected officials accountable and say, what are you doing to make things more accessible? How are we going to continue to include more people in our political process? I also realize that this is a very exclusively Western American privilege. Not every country has this ability to hold their candidates accountable. Not every person has the ability to ask these folks these questions. You know, I look at other countries in Eastern civilization where children are not able to go to school, where those who menstruate are unable to go and seek an education, and you can't ask that of anybody. You can't talk about it. It's still very taboo. So I feel that it's an opportunity for us to, one, yes, ask electorally how we can continue to move the conversation forward, but we can't rely on politicians to do the work. We, as a society, have to continue to do the work forward and hold them accountable. We're seeing this in various issues now, and this is the work that has to continue. So it could go either way.
Thank you. I know, as so many of us know here, civic engagement isn't really accessible to everyone. There's so much disabled voter suppression. People who are undocumented in the United States don't have access to vote. So I think that in order to look at these rights, we need to look at them in, as we've kind of, the theme of this conversation has been, we need to look at them with complexity. We need to look at them intersectionally on how we gain these rights. So I want to thank you all so much for coming and engaging in this community where we can speak about these issues openly and see it with more nuance and complexity. I really appreciate it. So those are all the questions we have for today. But if anyone has anything to add about absolutely anything here, at any of these issues, I leave it for any of you to give a final word or to add anything else. Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop recording now.